The air in the chrysalis chamber was sterile, scrubbed of all scent, all life, leaving only the cold, metallic tang of recycled oxygen and the faint, ozonic hum of the purifiers. It was a blank slate, a void upon which a masterpiece of deception was about to be painted. Elian stood motionless at its center, his body a canvas. His skin, pale under the recessed lumen strips, was a testament to a life lived indoors, under observation, away from the unpredictable chaos of sun and wind. He was not a person. He was an instrument, finely tuned and meticulously maintained. The thought was a mantra, a shield against the faint tremor in his hands. He was Unit 734, an asset, a weapon honed for a single, perfect strike. Director Valerius watched from the observation deck, his silhouette a sharp, dark cut against the frosted glass. He did not need to speak for Elian to feel the weight of his gaze, a physical pressure that settled between his shoulder blades. Valerius was the architect of his existence, the voice that had replaced a mother's, the hand that had guided his every lesson in control, in suppression, in the artifice of emotion. Today was the culmination of that work, the final examination. The target was Kalen Voronova, Alpha of the Ethelgard Reach, a man who represented a dangerous regression to a past the consortium had worked for decades to sterilize and contain. Voronova championed natural dynamics, uncontrolled pheromonal expression, the messy, unpredictable bonds that the consortium had replaced with placid, chemically enforced order. He was an anomaly, a threat to their perfect, silent world. And so, he had to be silenced. A technician with a face as neutral as the chamber walls approached, her movements precise and economical. She held a tray of silver instruments. Elian did not flinch as she began the application. First came the inhibitors, a cool gel smoothed over his wrists and the delicate skin behind his ears, neutralizing his own faint omega signature. It was a scent he barely knew himself, suppressed since childhood, a ghost of an identity he had never been allowed to claim. He was a blank page, ready to be written upon. Then came the emitters, small, translucent discs that adhered to his pulse points. They were cold against his skin, a foreign presence that would soon become his voice, his lure. The technician activated them with a soft click. A fragrance began to bloom in the sterile air, insidious and expertly crafted. It was not a single note, but a complex chord of manufactured pheromones designed to bypass an alpha's conscious defenses and whisper directly to the primal core. It spoke of vulnerability, of need, of a soft-edged loneliness that begged for completion. It was a beautiful, intricate lie. The scent was called Eventide, a name chosen for its poetic melancholy, a detail Valerius would have appreciated. It smelled of rain-soaked earth, of crushed lavender, and a faint, almost imperceptible hint of salt, like tears dried on skin. It was designed to evoke a protective instinct so profound it bordered on ownership. The profile is absolute, Valerius's voice finally came, filtered through the chamber's hidden speakers. It was a voice stripped of warmth, a scalpel of sound. Alpha Voronova presents as a traditionalist. He values strength, but his intelligence reports suggest a latent savior complex. He collects the broken, the outcast. He perceives himself as a bastion against our soulless order. You will be the most exquisitely broken thing he has ever found. Elian's eyes remained fixed on his own reflection in the polished chrome of a nearby console. The person staring back was a stranger. His hair, the color of pale ash, had been styled to look artlessly soft. His eyes, naturally a cool grey, now seemed deeper, shadowed with a synthetic sorrow. The clothes laid out for him were simple, elegant, made of fabrics that whispered of old money and quiet tragedy. Every detail was a carefully chosen word in the story he was about to tell. A story of a lost, gentle Omega, overwhelmed by the harshness of the galaxy, seeking refuge. Your cover is that of Rhys Alistair, the last scion of a fallen mercantile house from the outer sectors, Valerius continued, the words falling like chips of ice. Your family's assets were absorbed by the consortium after a series of unfortunate miscalculations. You are adrift. You have come to the Ethelgard Reach because you heard it was a place of sanctuary. The narrative was plausible, easily verifiable up to a point, and designed to pluck the precise strings of Voronova's psyche. You will not rush the contact. You will allow him to discover you. You will be a puzzle he feels compelled to solve. His desire to protect you will be his undoing. The final piece of equipment was placed in Elian's hand. It was a cufflink, heavy and cold, made of brushed platinum. To the naked eye, it was an accessory, but a specific pressure sequence would release a microdart from its face, silent and nearly invisible. The dart contained CX-9, a neurotoxin that didn't kill, but severed the connection between will and action. It would leave Kalen Voronova a living shell, his mind intact, but his body a puppet for the consortium to command. His formidable empire would fold without a single shot fired. Once you have gained access to his private quarters, once the bond of trust is absolute, you will deploy the asset, Valerius stated. There is no margin for error. Your retirement is contingent upon this success. Retirement. The word was a myth, a fairy tale whispered to the assets to ensure compliance. Elian knew, in the cold, logical part of his mind, that Valerius had failed to excise, that there was no peaceful retirement for a weapon like him. Weapons were used until they broke, or until they were no longer needed. And then they were melted down. But the lie was a necessary one. It was a sliver of light under a door that was permanently locked. It was the only thing that resembled hope. He closed his fingers around the cufflink, its coldness a familiar comfort. He was not Rhys Alistair. He was not an Omega seeking shelter. He was Unit 734. He was the whisper of eventide in a sterile room. He was the silence that would fall over the Ethelgard Reach. The tremor in his hands had stopped. The instrument was tuned. The performance was about to begin. The door to the chrysalis chamber hissed open, revealing a corridor that led to the transport bay, and beyond it, a world of scent and chaos he was built to corrupt. He took a breath of the false, beautiful air and stepped forward, leaving the reflection of the stranger behind. He was a ghost wearing a dead man's name, carrying a scent that promised heaven and a touch that would deliver a silent, living hell. The transport shuttle descended through the upper atmosphere of Ethelgard, and for the first time in his life, Elian felt turbulence. In the sterile, perfectly calibrated world of the consortium, travel was a seamless transition from one controlled environment to another. Here, the air itself had texture, a will. The small craft shuddered, buffeted by winds that swept down from the planet's jagged, snow-capped mountains. Through the viewport, he saw not the gleaming, uniform cityscape of the core worlds, but a sprawling settlement that seemed to have grown organically from the landscape itself. Buildings of dark, quarried stone and rich, polished wood were nestled into the valleys, their lines echoing the surrounding peaks. There was a raw, untamed beauty to it that felt both intimidating and strangely liberating. The air that cycled into the cabin as they prepared for landing was a riot of a sensation. It was thick with the scent of pine and cold stone, of wood smoke and damp earth. Underneath it all was a complex tapestry of living pheromones, the ambient signatures of thousands of people living without the consortium's suppressants and inhibitors. It was overwhelming, a cacophony to his carefully shielded senses. It felt like stepping out of a soundproofed room into the middle of a roaring orchestra. He was escorted from the landing pad by a silent guard in the dark grey uniform of the Ethel Guard Enclave. The guard, a beta, moved with an easy confidence, his presence a stark contrast to the rigid, almost robotic posture of consortium enforcers. Here, discipline did not seem to be synonymous with the eradication of personality. They walked through open-air corridors and across bridges that spanned deep, verdant chasms. Waterfalls cascaded down sheer rock faces, misting the air with a clean, sharp scent that cut through the heavier notes of the city. Elian kept his head slightly bowed, his posture curated to project weariness and a fragile sort of grace. He was Rhys Alistair. He was lost. He was here to be found. The reception was being held in the great hall of Voronova's citadel, a cavernous space that felt more like a cathedral dedicated to the mountain itself than a room in a fortress. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, supported by massive pillars of unpolished granite that disappeared into the shadows. One entire wall was a sheet of armored glass, looking out onto a breathtaking panorama of the sun setting behind the colossal peaks. The light, a deep, liquid gold, poured into the hall, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting long, dramatic shadows. The room was filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. Alphas, betas, and omegas mingled freely, their scents interweaving into a rich, heady perfume that made the synthetic eventide clinging to Elian's skin feel thin and false. He felt a profound sense of otherness, of being a counterfeit coin in a treasury of authentic gold. He took a glass of chilled wine from a serving drone and found a quiet alcove, positioning himself to be visible but not conspicuous. He was a piece of bait, waiting for the predator to notice. And then he felt it, a shift in the room's atmosphere, a subtle quieting of the ambient chatter. It was as if a powerful magnetic field had just been switched on, pulling everyone's attention, willing or not, toward a single point. Kalen Voronova had arrived. He stood near the grand entrance, speaking with a group of his senior council members. He was taller than his profile data had indicated, with a breadth of shoulder that spoke of genuine physical strength, not the sculpted, cosmetic enhancements favored by consortium elites. His hair was dark, cut short, and a faint tracery of silver at his temples caught the dying sunlight. He wore a simple, dark tunic of a heavy, textured material that seemed to absorb the light around him. But it was his scent that struck Elian like a physical blow. It was nothing like the aggressive, dominant musk of the alphas Elian had been trained to simulate responses to. Voronova's scent was deep and complex, like the forest floor after a storm, notes of cedarwood, rich soil, and a sharp, clean hint of ozone. It was a scent that spoke not of dominance, but of presence, of absolute, unshakable centeredness. It was real, terribly, dangerously real. Elian lowered his gaze, focusing on the wine swirling in his glass, letting the manufactured pheromones of eventide do their work. He could feel the moment Voronova's attention landed on him. It wasn't a glance. It was a focused, penetrating wait. He could feel it scanning his posture, his clothes, the carefully constructed aura of sorrow that surrounded him. He waited, his heart a cold, steady metronome in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the alpha began to move. He crossed the floor with a slow, deliberate grace, his presence parting the crowd without a single word or gesture. He stopped a few feet away from Elian's alcove. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Elian finally lifted his head, as if startled from a reverie, and met the alpha's eyes. They were a dark, startling shade of grey, the colour of a storm-tossed sea. And they were not looking at him with the pity or protective instinct his scent was designed to elicit. They were looking at him with an unnerving, analytical calm. It was the look of a master artisan examining a piece of complex and possibly flawed clockwork. "You are new to Ethelgard," Kalen Voronova said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and resonant, yet carrying the same weight as his presence. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Elian gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of submission he had practiced 1,000 times. "Rhys Alistair," he offered, his own voice soft, intentionally pitched to sound fragile. "I arrived only this morning, my lord." The honorific was a calculated choice, meant to appeal to the traditionalist aspect of the alpha's profile. Voronova's expression didn't change. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth, but it did not reach his eyes. "There are no lords in Ethelgard, Mr. Alistair, only citizens." He took a step closer, and the full force of his natural scent washed over Relian. It was clean and powerful, and it made the artificial eventide feel like a cheap, cloying perfume. "Your scent," the alpha said, his voice dropping even lower, drawing Elian into a bubble of forced intimacy. "It is unusual, like a memory of a place rather than the place itself." Elian's blood ran cold. The observation was too precise, too poetic. It was not the reaction of a man being seduced. It was the observation of a connoisseur identifying a forgery. In that moment, the carefully constructed reality of his mission fractured, and for the first time, Elian felt a tremor of genuine, unscripted fear. The game had begun, but he was suddenly, terrifyingly unsure of who was the player and who was the piece. The plan, as outlined by Valerius, was a delicate dance of escalating vulnerability. The first step was to create an incident, a public display of fragility that would necessitate Kalen's intervention and establish the dynamic of protector and protected. Elian had rehearsed the scenario in simulations hundreds of times. A crowded corridor, a moment of feigned dizziness, a stumble into the alpha's path. It was simple, classic, and according to the consortium's psychological profiling, guaranteed to trigger Voronova's ingrained protective instincts. Elian chose his moment carefully, 2 days after the reception. He had spent the intervening time exploring the lower levels of the citadel, projecting an air of aimless melancholy, a ghost haunting the stone halls. He knew Kalen's schedule. The alpha walked this particular corridor every day after his morning council meeting, usually alone. The corridor was busy, filled with aides and officials, providing the necessary audience for the performance. He saw Kalen approaching. From the far end, his long, confident stride eating up the distance. Elian took a steadying breath, the artificial scent of eventide pulsing from the emitters on his skin. He felt a pang of something sharp and unpleasant, the beginning of a headache, a common side effect of prolonged exposure to the high-grade synthetics. He pushed the feeling down. The mission was everything. As Kalen drew near, Elian pressed a hand to his temple, his expression clouding with a carefully practiced wave of faintness. He swayed, his steps faltering. His eyes, fixed on the polished stone floor, tracked the Alpha's approach. 3 more steps. 2. 1. He allowed his knees to buckle, launching himself into a controlled fall, angling his body to intercept Kalen's path. It was a movement he could perform in his sleep, a piece of physical choreography as ingrained as breathing. He expected to collide with a solid wall of muscle, to be caught in a firm, reactive grip. He anticipated the Alpha's scent flaring with protective concern, the low growl of displeasure at seeing an Omega in distress. What happened was subtly, jarringly different. Kalen's movement was too smooth, too prepared. He didn't catch Elian, he intercepted him. One strong arm wrapped around his waist, halting his fall not with a jolt, but with a fluid, almost gentle strength that felt less like a reaction and more like a pre-calculated maneuver. He was steadying a leaning statue, not saving a falling person. The crowd in the corridor parted, murmuring with concern. Elian leaned heavily against the Alpha, his head bowed, feigning disorientation. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice a strained thread of sound. "I don't know what. I just felt—" "Be still," Kalen's voice rumbled, close to his ear. The scent of cedar and ozone was grounding, a stark contrast to the cloying sweetness of his own manufactured perfume. But there was no flare of Alpha possessiveness, no scent of alarm. There was only that same unnerving, absolute calm. Kalen's hand was a firm, warm weight on his back, but his touch was impersonal, clinical. He was managing a situation, not succumbing to an instinct. He looked up at one of his aides, a stern-faced beta woman who was watching the scene with narrowed eyes. "Clear the corridor," Kalen commanded, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that had people moving instantly. Within seconds, they were alone. Kalen did not release him immediately. He held Elian steady, his gaze sweeping over him, taking in the feigned tremor in his limbs, the carefully constructed pallor of his skin. Elian kept his eyes downcast, waiting for the script to continue. The Alpha would lead him to a quiet room, offer him water, ask him questions born of concern. It was the next logical step. Instead, Kalen shifted his grip slightly, his fingers brushing against the pulse point on Elian's wrist, directly over one of the pheromone emitters. The touch was light, inquisitive. Elian's breath hitched, a genuine reaction this time. "Your pulse is remarkably steady," Kalen observed, his voice a soft murmur that was somehow more intimidating than a shout. For someone on the verge of collapse, panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Elian's conditioning. This was wrong. The dialogue was wrong. The Alpha's reaction was deviating wildly from the projected models. He was supposed to be solicitous, concerned, perhaps even a little flustered. He was not supposed to be analytical. He was not supposed to be checking his vital signs with the detached air of a physician. I am often unwell," Elian stammered, falling back on his cover story's tragic undertones. The consortium's physicians could never find a cause. He tried to pull away slightly, to re-establish the illusion of fragility. Kalen allowed the movement, but his hand slid from Elian's back up to his shoulder, a grip that was both supportive and restraining. The consortium has many skilled physicians, Kalen said, his eyes still fixed on Elian's face, searching for something beyond the mask. They are particularly skilled in the arts of fabrication, chemical, biological, narrative. Each word was delivered with a quiet precision that made the hairs on Elian's arms stand on end. He was not talking about medicine. He was talking about him. Elian felt a dizzying sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with his act. He was an actor on a stage whose director had just walked off, leaving him under the hot, bright lights with an audience of one who knew, somehow, that the whole play was a farce. Kalen finally straightened, releasing him. Elian swayed for a moment, genuinely unsteady this time, and caught himself against the cool stone wall. The Alpha watched him, his expression unreadable. "You should rest, Mr. Alistair," he said, the formal address sounding almost ironic. "My citadel is vast. I trust you will find a quiet place to recover your strength." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and continued down the now empty corridor, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. He did not look back. Elian was left leaning against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs with a frantic, unscheduled rhythm. The scent of eventide seemed to choke him, a cheap, synthetic lie in the face of that overwhelming, knowing calm. The first move of the game had been played, and he had a sickening feeling that he had just been checkmated before he even understood the rules. He was not the seducer. He was the one being dissected. From the panoramic window of his private study, Kalen watched the figure of Rhys Alistair make his slow, seemingly unsteady way back toward the guest quarters. The performance was exquisite, he had to admit. The slight limp, the weary slump of the shoulders, the way he kept a hand pressed to his side, as if nursing a constant, invisible pain. Every movement was a brushstroke in a portrait of tragic vulnerability. It was a masterpiece of conditioning, and it filled Kalen with a profound and chilling sadness. He had known the moment the Omega stepped onto the landing pad. His intelligence network, far more sophisticated than the consortium imagined, had flagged the transport a week ago. A single passenger, cleared with the highest level of consortium diplomatic coding, but with a biosignature that was suspiciously blank, almost a void. It was the calling card of the silencer program. He had read the fragmented, whispered reports for years of Omegas taken as children, their identities erased, their bodies turned into delivery systems for political assassination and corporate espionage. They were ghosts, trained in the arts of emotional manipulation, their own pheromones suppressed and replaced with weaponized synthetics. He had never seen one in the flesh. When he had approached the boy at the reception, the scent had confirmed it. Eventide, a clever name for a chemical weapon. It smelled of loss and longing, a siren song composed in a laboratory designed to prey on the most fundamental alpha instincts. But beneath the cloying, artificial sweetness, Kalen could sense the truth. His own senses, honed by a life lived away from the consortium's dulling inhibitors, were sharp enough to detect the dissonance. The scent was a perfect, flawless surface, but it had no depth. It was like a photorealistic painting of a forest that lacked the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was a beautiful, hollow thing, and beneath it, almost imperceptible, was a void where a person's true scent should be. That null space was more terrifying than any pheromonal threat. The stumble in the hallway had been the next predictable, pathetic move in their playbook. He had watched Elian. He refused to think of him, by the false name, position himself, time the approach, execute the fall with a dancer's precision. There was no weakness in it, only control. When he had caught him, he had felt the coiled tension in the slender body, the rigid discipline holding the feigned fragility in place. The boy's heart rate, which he'd checked at the wrist, was as calm and steady as a meditating monk's. It was the pulse of a soldier in the middle of an operation, not a frail Omega, overwhelmed by a dizzy spell. He had played along, of course. He had delivered his lines, cleared the corridor, offered the prescribed response. To do otherwise would be to show his hand too early. The consortium was watching, he had no doubt. The boy would be covered in micro-surveillance tech, his every interaction monitored and analyzed by the bloodless creature that ran the program, Director Valerius. Kalen turned from the window and settled into the large chair behind his desk, which was carved from the heartwood of a single massive ironwood tree. He steepled his fingers, his gaze distant. This was not just an assassination attempt. It was a test. The consortium wanted to see if their most subtle weapon could breach his defenses. They saw his Ethel Guard reach, with its emphasis on natural law and individual freedom, as a chaotic anomaly to be neutralized and absorbed. They saw his rejection of their chemical controls and social engineering as a threat to their entire ideology. They could not crush him with military force. His position was too entrenched, his people too loyal. So they sent a beautiful, broken boy to do it with a whisper and a poisoned touch. His anger was a cold, deep thing, not a hot flare. It was directed not at the Omega, but at the system that had unmade him. They had taken a person and hollowed him out, filling the void with obedience and lies. They had turned him into a living trap. What was his real name? What was his true scent? What dreams had they scraped from his mind to make room for their protocols? He felt a surge of the very instinct the consortium was trying to manipulate. Protection. But it was not for the fragile, fictional Rhys Alistair. It was for the prisoner trapped inside that meticulously crafted facade. Elian, Unit 734, a name like a serial number on a rifle. He would play their game. He would allow the seduction to proceed, step by painful step. He would let this Rhys Alistair into his space, into his confidence. He would walk willingly into the trap, because the only way to disarm a trap is to understand its mechanism. And the only way to save the boy was to force him to see the cage he was in, to show him that the door, which he had been told was locked forever, was actually open. It was a dangerous strategy. The toxin, he knew, would be potent. A single mistake, a single moment of miscalculation, and his entire world would crumble. But Kalen Voronova had not built the Ethelgard reach by being timid. He looked at the security feed on his desk monitor, a small, silent image of Elian entering his assigned quarters. The boy moved with an exhausted grace that was no longer part of the act. The strain of the performance, of maintaining the lie under Kalen's knowing gaze, was already taking its toll. The first cracks were beginning to show. Good, Kalen thought, a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. Let them show. Let it all fall apart. Only then could something new, something real, be built in its place. He would not be the Omega's target. He would be his catalyst. Days bled into a week, each one a slow, agonizing turn of a screw for Elian. He lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade tension, the space between his own fractured reality and the fiction he was forced to perform growing wider with every passing hour. He arranged more chance encounters with Kalen, each one more draining than the last. He would be reading a data slate in the Citadel's vast library, and Kalen would appear, selecting a text from a nearby shelf. He would be watching the distant waterfalls from a secluded balcony, and Kalen would join him, standing in a comfortable, unnerving silence. There, conversations were a strange and delicate duel. Elian would offer a carefully planted piece of his cover story, a fabricated memory of his family's lost estate, a wistful comment on the beauty of Ethelgard that hinted at his desire for a permanent sanctuary. Kalen would listen, his expression one of polite interest, but his responses were always just slightly off-key. He would ask questions that seemed innocuous on the surface, but were designed to probe the edges of the fiction. "Tell me of your mother," he asked once, as they stood by the roaring fire in the great hall. "What was her scent?" Elian froze. The profile of Rhys Alistair had a mother, of course, a gentle, artistic Omega named Lyra. But her scent, that was a detail the file hadn't included. It was a question no one would think to ask, because for most of the galaxy, living under consortium rule, a person's scent was a muted, suppressed thing, barely noticeable. Only here, in this place of vibrant, untamed senses, would it be a primary identifier, a key component of memory. Elian's mind raced, scrambling for a plausible fabrication. "She smelled of old books," he said, the words feeling clumsy and false in his mouth. "And jasmine tea." Kalen nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the flames. "A lovely sentiment," he said, his voice neutral. "But not a scent. A scent is a living thing. It is the biosignature of the soul." He said nothing more on the subject, but the point had been made. Elian's answer had been a poet's description, not a son's memory. The headaches were getting worse. The constant, high-frequency pulse of the emitters was creating a painful pressure behind his eyes. Sometimes his vision would swim, the edges of the world blurring for a moment. He was beginning to have trouble distinguishing the artificial emotions projected by the eventide pheromones from his own growing sense of confusion and dread. The loneliness the scent projected was starting to feel real, a gnawing emptiness that the consortium's conditioning had never quite managed to fill. He found himself watching the people of the Citadel with a strange, aching envy. He saw an alpha artisan gently scent-marking his Omega mate as they haggled over produce in the market. He saw a beta mother laughing as her child chased a flock of birds in a courtyard. These were small, simple moments of connection, of uninhibited emotion, of a life he couldn't even begin to comprehend. They were everything he was not. One evening, he found Kalen in the Citadel's Arboretum, a massive glass dome that housed an impossible collection of flora from a dozen worlds. The air was warm and humid, thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming flowers. It was a relief from the cold stone of the fortress, but the sheer sensory input made Elian's head spin. Kalen was standing before a strange, bioluminescent plant, its pale blue petals glowing softly in the twilight. He didn't seem surprised to see Elian. "The cinder lily," Kalen said without turning. "It blooms only in the dark. It feeds on metallic isotopes in the soil. Most would call it a mutation, a perversion of nature. I find it beautiful. It has learned to thrive on what would poison others." The parallel was so obvious, so pointed, that Elian felt his breath catch in his throat. He was the cinder lily, thriving on the poison of the consortium, blooming in the darkness of his mission. He took a step closer, forcing himself back into character. "It is beautiful," he agreed, his voice a soft murmur. "But it must be lonely, blooming when all the other flowers are asleep." It was a perfect line, laced with the manufactured melancholy of Rhys Alistair. Kaelan finally turned to face him. His grey eyes were dark in the dim blue light of the lily. "Perhaps," he said softly. "Or perhaps it simply understands that some things are too fragile to survive the harsh light of day." He reached out, not to touch Elian, but to gently cup one of the glowing petals. His fingers were long and steady. "Tell me, Rhys," he said, his gaze flicking from the flower to Elian's face. "What do you do when you are not being sad?" The question was so unexpected, so disarmingly direct, that it shattered Elian's composure. He had no answer. Rhys Alistair's entire personality was constructed around a tragic past and a fragile present. He had no hobbies, no passions, no interests beyond his own sorrow. The character had no life outside his function, and neither, Elian realized with a sickening jolt, did he. I don't understand," he stammered, the words coming out before he could stop them. For the first time, it was not an act. He was genuinely, utterly lost. Kaelan's expression softened, a flicker of something that looked like genuine sympathy in his eyes. "I think you do," he said, his voice gentle. He withdrew his hand from the lily and held it out, palm up. An invitation. "There is a music room on the upper level. The acoustics are perfect. I go there sometimes when the silence of this fortress becomes too loud. Will you join me?" It was a deviation from the plan, a social invitation that had not been anticipated. But refusing would be suspicious, and some part of him, a part he didn't recognize, was tired of the silence and the lies. He gave a hesitant nod. As he placed his hand in Kaelan's, he felt a strange, forbidden warmth spread through him. It was the first time he had touched someone without a tactical objective. It was terrifying, and it felt more real than anything he had ever known. The pressure from Director Valerius came, as expected, in the dead of night. It was not a call or a message, but a sub-vocal transmission that vibrated directly against his inner ear, a technology that was undetectable and impossible to ignore. The voice was a cold spike of static in the quiet of his chambers. "Status report, Unit 734. You have been on site for 9 days. Proximity has been established, but the target's trust is not yet absolute. The timeline is becoming compressed. Explain the delay." Elian sat bolt upright in his bed, the phantom voice echoing in his skull. He squeezed his eyes shut, the headache that had become his constant companion flaring with renewed intensity. The music room, the memory of it surfaced, unbidden. Kaelan hadn't spoken much. He had simply sat at a grand, old piano, its wood dark and lustrous, and he had played. The music was complex, melancholic, and beautiful, filling the vast, empty space with a tide of sound. Elian had just listened, the intricate melodies washing over him, temporarily silencing the frantic calculations in his own mind. For a single, terrifying hour, he had forgotten he was on a mission. He had forgotten he was Unit 734. He had simply been present. "The target is methodical," Elian transmitted back, forming the words in his mind, the process feeling like scraping his thoughts against rough stone. "He does not grant trust easily. A rushed approach would compromise the entire operation. My assessment is that the emotional groundwork is nearly complete." It was the correct, clinical response. It was also a lie. The groundwork wasn't just laid. It was a tangled mess of foundations he no longer understood. Kaelan wasn't trusting him. Kalen was dissecting him, piece by patient piece, and Elian was letting him. "Your assessment is noted," Valerius's mental voice replied, edged with impatience. "But your emotional metrics are showing anomalies. Your cortisol levels are elevated beyond acceptable mission parameters. Your biofeedback indicates a state of cognitive dissonance. Are you becoming compromised, unit?" The word hung in the silence of his mind. Compromised. It was the consortium's term for failure, for developing feelings, for becoming human. It was the precursor to decommissioning. "No," he whispered aloud, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet room. "No," he thought, directing the denial back at his handler with all the force he could muster. "Negative. The anomalies are a calculated part of the infiltration. I am mirroring the target's empathetic responses to build a faster rapport. It is a controlled bleed." Another lie. The bleed wasn't controlled. It was a hemorrhage. He felt like he was unraveling, the tight threads of his conditioning loosening with every quiet conversation, every knowing look from the alpha. There was a long pause, the mental silence more unnerving than the voice. "Very well. But the council grows impatient. You have 3 days to secure access to his private quarters and deploy the asset. 3 days, Unit 734. Do not fail us. We do not tolerate faulty equipment." The connection severed, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence and a fresh wave of pain behind Elian's eyes. Faulty equipment. That's all he was. A tool that was beginning to show signs of wear. He stumbled out of bed and to the small washroom, splashing cold water on his face. He looked at his reflection through the mirror. The face of Rhys Alistair stared back, but it looked different now. The practiced sadness in his eyes was being eclipsed by a genuine, hunted fear. The synthetic pheromones, which he now had to reapply twice a day to maintain their potency, were irritating the skin on his wrists, leaving faint red marks. He felt sick. The scent of eventide, once a tool, now felt like a shroud, suffocating him. That night, his sleep was a black, dreamless pit. But he woke from it with a gasp, the ghost of a memory clinging to him. A small room, painted a sterile white, the sting of a needle, Valerius's voice, younger but just as cold, repeating a phrase over and over until it was burned into his mind. "You have no name. You have no scent. You have no self. You are ours." He rose and dressed, his movements stiff and robotic. He had to finish this. The only way out was forward. Failure meant decommissioning. Success meant a retirement that was almost certainly the same thing. But it was a chance, however slim. He had to escalate. He had to force the final move. He found Kalen on the Citadel's highest observation deck, a windswept platform of stone that jutted out over a sheer 1,000-foot drop. The morning air was thin and bitingly cold. The Alpha stood at the precipice, looking out at the endless sea of mountain peaks, a lone, dark figure against the pale sky. Elian walked to his side, the wind whipping his hair and tugging at his clothes. He didn't speak, just stood there, letting the cold seep into his bones. This was it, the final act of the vulnerable Omega. He would confess his fears, his loneliness, his desperation. He would throw himself on the mercy of the Alpha, a final, irresistible lure. "I'm afraid," he began, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. He let a tremor enter his tone, a skill he had perfected. "I have nowhere else to go. The consortium, they took everything. I fear they will not stop until they have taken me, too." He looked up at Kalen, his eyes wide, pleading. It was the best performance of his life. He was laying his synthetic soul bare. Kalen was silent for a long moment, his gaze remaining on the horizon. The wind howled around them, a lonely, desolate sound. "Fear is a rational response to an irrational world," the Alpha said finally, his voice calm and even. He turned his head, his grey eyes meeting Elian's. There was no pity in them, only a profound, weary clarity. "But it is a poor foundation upon which to build a life. Or a lie." He took a step closer, shielding Elian from the worst of the wind. His proximity was overwhelming. "Your performance has been commendable, Unit 734, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was still audible over the gale. "But the play is over." The world did not shatter. It simply dissolved, like sugar in water, leaving Elian adrift in a cold, terrifying, new reality. The wind seemed to steal the air from his lungs. The name, his designation, spoken so calmly from the Alpha's lips, was a physical blow. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. Every protocol, every line of conditioning, every contingency plan in his mind evaporated into nothing. He was stripped bare, his mask torn away, leaving him exposed and utterly, hopelessly lost. Kalen's expression was not one of triumph or anger. It was one of deep, resonant sorrow. He saw the terror in Elian's eyes, the complete collapse of his carefully constructed world, and it seemed to pain him. "Come," Kalen said gently, his voice a low anchor in the screaming wind. "Let's get out of the cold. There is much we need to discuss." He placed a hand on Elian's shoulder, not to restrain him, but to guide him. The touch was firm, steady, and in that moment of absolute desolation, it was the only thing in the universe that felt real. Elian followed, his legs moving on their own, his mind a silent, screaming void. He had walked onto the stage a master of deception. He was leaving it a naked, nameless ghost. Kalen's private chambers were nothing like the cold, tactical command centers favored by consortium leadership. They were warm, lived in, and profoundly personal. Books overflowed from shelves that reached the high, vaulted ceiling. Maps of unknown star systems were pinned to one wall, marked with handwritten notes. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering light over the rich, dark wood of the furniture. The air smelled of old paper, of wood smoke, and of Kalen's own grounding scent of cedar and rain. It was a sanctuary, a place of quiet contemplation and absolute power. And for Elian, it was the execution chamber. He stood in the center of the room, feeling small and terribly exposed. The cufflink on his left wrist felt as heavy as a manacle. The toxin inside it was a mockery of his failure. He had reached the final stage of his mission, not as a cunning operative, but as a captured pawn. Kalen moved to a small cabinet and poured 2 glasses of a dark amber liquid. He held one out to Elian. "Brandy," he said. "It will help with the cold." Elian stared at the glass, his hands trembling too much to take it. His mind was still reeling, trying to process the impossible. He knew. He had known all along. Every conversation, every shared silence, every probing question, it had all been a test, a game he hadn't even realized he was playing and had lost from the very first move. How? The word was a dry rasp, torn from his throat. Kalen took a slow sip from his own glass, his eyes never leaving Elian's face. "The consortium believes that control is a matter of technology and chemistry. They underestimate the value of listening," he said. "They sent a silencer to my doorstep, a ghost with no official existence, on a ship with the highest diplomatic clearance. His scent was a laboratory's dream of sorrow. It wasn't a subtle opening gambit. It was a declaration of intent, screamed through a megaphone. He set his glass down and walked toward Elian, stopping a few feet away. I have been studying the silencer program for years. I know what they do. I know how they make you. His voice was low, laced with a cold anger that was far more terrifying than any overt threat. It was an anger directed not at Elian, but at his creators. They take children. They strip them of their identity. They burn out their senses and replace them with sensors. They teach them arias of seduction and give them a single poisoned kiss to deliver. They are the most monstrous thing the consortium has ever conceived. Elian flinched as if struck, hearing his life, his entire existence, summarized with such brutal, pitying accuracy, was like having his skin peeled away. He took a step back, his hand instinctively going to the cufflink, a last, desperate, futile gesture. Kalen saw the movement. He didn't tense. He didn't move to disarm him. He simply watched him with those impossibly calm, grey eyes. "The toxin in your left cufflink," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Is it fast-acting? Or is it the kind that allows for a few moments of conversation before the nervous system collapses?" Valerius always did have a flair for the dramatic. The world tilted on its axis. Every defense, every last shred of denial crumbled into dust. It was over. A profound, hollow emptiness washed over Elian, so vast and complete it was almost peaceful. The fight was gone. The conditioning was shattered. There was nothing left. "It's slow," Elian heard himself say, the words distant, as if spoken by someone else. "He wants you to be aware as your body betrays you. He wants you to know you've been conquered." A bitter, humorless smile touched Kalen's lips. "Of course he does. Tyranny requires an audience." He closed the remaining distance between them, and Elian found he could not move, frozen not by fear, but by a strange, paralyzing sense of inevitability. Kalen gently took Elian's left hand, his thumb brushing over the cold platinum of the cufflink. Elian's breath hitched. He expected Kalen to rip it from his shirt, to break his wrist, to neutralize the threat. Instead, the alpha's touch was surprisingly gentle. He looked from the cufflink to Elian's eyes, and what Elian saw there was not contempt or hatred. It was an aching, profound sadness. "They promised you retirement, didn't they?" Kalen asked softly. "A life of peace and quiet after this one last job, a reward for your loyal service." Elian could only nod, a single jerky movement. "There is no retirement for assets, Elian," Kalen said, and the use of his real name, the name he hadn't heard since he was a child, was a fresh shock, a key turning in a lock deep inside him. "There is only disposal. When a tool is no longer useful, it is discarded. You succeed. They kill you to tie up the loose end. You fail. They decommission you as faulty equipment. The outcome for you is the same. The only variable was whether or not I died with you." The truth of it, cold and absolute, settled into Elian's bones. He had always known it, on some level, but he had clung to the lie because the truth was too terrible to face. Now, with Kalen's quiet, steady gaze on him, there was nowhere left to hide. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, welled in his eyes, blurring the alpha's face into a smudge of grey and gold. He had not cried since he was a small boy, before the conditioning had burned such useless emotions out of him. The sensation was agonizing, a tearing, cathartic release of a lifetime of suppressed pain. He was not a weapon. He was not an asset. He was a broken, weeping boy in his enemy's chambers, and he had never been more himself. Kalen watched the tears trace silver paths down Elian's pale cheeks, and his heart ached with a fury so cold it felt like ice in his veins. This was the consortium's masterpiece, a human being so thoroughly broken that the simple, devastating truth of his own situation was enough to shatter him completely. He had seen the fight, the conditioning, the years of brutal training all dissolve in an instant, leaving behind only the raw, terrified core of the person they had tried to erase. He maintained his gentle hold on Elian's wrist, his thumb a steady, grounding pressure against the boy's frantic pulse. The sobs racking Elian's frame were silent, a testament to a lifetime of learning to suffer without making a sound. It was the most heartbreaking thing Kalen had ever witnessed. He had to force himself to remain calm, to keep his own scent level and non-threatening. Any flare of alpha anger or pity would only frighten the boy more, drive him further into the black pit of his despair. "This is not your fault," Kalen said, his voice low and firm, cutting through the haze of Elian's grief. "None of it. The choices that brought you here were never yours to make. They built your cage, Elian, and they forced you to call it a home. They forged you into a weapon and told you that your only purpose was to be fired. They lied." He guided the trembling Omega toward one of the large, comfortable chairs near the fire, pressing him gently into it. Elian collapsed into the soft leather, his body curling in on itself as if to minimize his own existence. Kalen knelt before him, bringing them eye to eye. He would not loom over him. He would not be another figure of authority dictating his reality. This moment had to be about a choice, the first real choice Elian had probably ever had. "Listen to me very carefully," Kalen said, his voice imbued with a quiet, compelling intensity. "Director Valerius is watching, not with cameras or audio bugs. Those were easy enough to block the moment you arrived. He is monitoring you through the emitters on your skin. They are two-way devices. They project a scent, but they also read your biometric data, your stress levels, your neural activity. He is listening to your body's reactions right now. He knows you are distressed. He knows the mission has gone wrong." Elian's head snapped up, fresh terror in his eyes. He was still connected, still a puppet on a string. "He will activate the termination protocol," Elian whispered, his voice hoarse. "There's a fail-safe, a lethal charge in the emitters. If an asset is compromised—" Kalen nodded slowly. "I know. A small electrical pulse, just enough to stop the heart. Clean, efficient, deniable. They would claim you died of a sudden, tragic medical event, the unwell Omega succumbing to his mysterious illness." He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, flat device of brushed silver, no larger than his thumb. He held it up for Elian to see. "This is a localized EMP. It will disrupt and deactivate any consortium technology within a 5-foot radius for approximately 10 seconds. It is long enough to shut down the emitters, the link to Valerius, and the failsafe. The moment I activate it, you will be dark to them. They will know the connection has been severed. They will assume you are dead, or that I have captured and disabled you. In either case, they will consider you a lost asset." He placed the device on the small table beside the chair. He did not activate it. "The choice, Elian, is yours," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You can continue to wear their collar. You can let them listen as you die, a final, perfect act of obedience. Or you can take it off. You can be free of them, truly free, for the first time in your life. If you choose freedom, you will have to fight for it. The consortium will not forgive this. They will hunt you, but you will not be fighting alone. I will stand with you." The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. The weight of the choice pressed down on Ilian, immense and terrifying. To be free. It was a concept so alien, so abstract, he could barely grasp its meaning. His entire life had been a series of commands, of missions, of externally imposed purposes. To choose for himself. What would he even choose? The conditioning screamed at him that this was a trick, a more elaborate form of manipulation. But the look in Kalen's eyes held no deceit. It held a grim promise, an offer of a difficult, dangerous path, but a path that would be his own. He looked at the silver device. He looked at the cufflink on his wrist, the symbol of his servitude. He thought of the cold voice of Valerius, of the sterile white rooms, of the ghost in the mirror. He thought of the music Kalen had played, a language of pure emotion he had felt but not understood. He thought of the cinder lily, blooming in the dark. Slowly, shakily, he reached out a hand and pointed to the EMP device. His fingers trembled, but his gaze, when he met Kalen's, was clear for the first time. It was a look of pure, defiant terror. "Do it," he whispered. Kalen held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, solemn nod. He picked up the device and pressed the activation stud. There was no sound, no flash of light, only a strange, tingling sensation in the air, like the moment before a lightning strike. Elian felt a sudden, sharp sting at his pulse points as the emitters shorted out. The cloying, artificial scent of eventide vanished, leaving the air clean and sharp. The phantom pressure of Valerius's observation in his mind was gone. The connection severed so abruptly it felt like a physical amputation. He was alone in his own head for the first time he could remember. The silence was vast, empty, and utterly, terrifyingly his own. He had made a choice. He was free, and he had just declared war on the only world he had ever known. The silence that followed the EMP activation was more profound than mere quiet. It was a void, an absence of the subliminal hum of technology and the mental weight of surveillance that had been Elian's constant companions for his entire life. In that void, other senses, long dormant and suppressed, began to stir. He became aware of the texture of the leather beneath his fingertips, the warmth of the fire on his face, the complex living scent of the room around him. And for the first time, faint and hesitant, he could smell himself. It was not a scent he recognized. It was green and sharp, like crushed stems after a rain, with a faint, underlying sweetness, like honey or clover. It was the scent of a stranger, and it was his. The revelation was so overwhelming he felt a wave of dizziness. He was a country he had never visited, a language he did not speak. Kalen gave him a moment, allowing him to acclimate to the sudden, shocking freedom. Then he moved with purpose. He retrieved a small medkit from a drawer in his desk. "The emitters," he said, his voice practical, grounding. "We need to remove them. The adhesive is corrosive." He knelt again before Elian, taking his wrist with a gentle but firm grip. Elian flinched, a reflexive, conditioned response to being touched with such clinical intent. "It's all right," Kalen said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." Elian forced himself to be still, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched as Kalen applied a solvent to the skin around the small, deactivated disc. The sting was sharp, but brief. With a pair of fine-tipped forceps, the alpha carefully peeled the emitter away, revealing a circle of raw, inflamed skin underneath. The sight of it, of the physical mark of his bondage, sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. Kalen cleaned the area with an antiseptic wipe and applied a soothing balm, his movements economical and precise. He repeated the process on the other wrist and the pulse points behind Elian's ears, working in a focused silence. When he was finished, he carefully unfastened the platinum cufflink, the weapon, from Elian's shirt. He held it in his palm for a moment, looking at the small, deadly object that represented the entire purpose of Elian's former life. Then, with a quiet finality, he placed it on the table next to the EMP device, two pieces of a past that was now officially over. "It's done," Kalen said, his gaze meeting Elian's. "They can't hear you. They can't track you. They can't hurt you from a distance anymore." Elian looked at his wrists, at the small circular wounds that were already beginning to heal under the balm. He felt empty, not hollowed out as he had before, but emptied of the poison that had filled him for so long. It was a clean, terrifying emptiness, waiting to be filled. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question was vast, encompassing everything. What do we do in the next 5 minutes? What do I do with the rest of my life? "Now," Kalen said, rising to his feet, "we begin to fight back." He went to his desk and activated a holographic display. A star chart bloomed in the air between them, shimmering with constellations and trade routes. "Your knowledge of the consortium's internal security protocols, their communication networks, their hidden facilities, it is invaluable. You are no longer their weapon, Elian. You are ours." He gestured to a sector of the chart, deep within the consortium's undisputed territory. A small, unremarkable star system was circled in red. "Director Valerius operates from a mobile command station, the Chrysalis. It's a ghost ship, constantly moving, its signature masked. They believe it's untraceable." He looked at Elian. "But you've been there. You know its routines, its energy signature, the feel of its recycled air. Your memories are the key to finding him." The thought of the chrysalis, of the sterile white rooms, and the constant, cold observation made Elian's stomach clench. To willingly return his thoughts to that place felt like a violation. But Kalen was right. His trauma was now a weapon to be turned back against his tormentors. "I can try," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I can tell you everything I remember." A new dynamic began to form in the warm, fire-lit room. Kalen was no longer a target, and Elian was no longer a seducer. They were commander and intelligence asset, strategist and survivor. Kalen asked questions, his voice calm and methodical, and Elian answered, dredging up details from the depths of his memory. He spoke of the sub-vocal communication frequencies, the security clearances, the psychological conditioning techniques used on the other trainees, the other children. He described the layout of the medical bays where the emitters were implanted, the cold sleep pods used for long-distance travel. Each memory was a painful shard of glass, but as he laid them out, he felt a sense of power. He was deconstructing his cage piece by piece. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and the brandy in their glasses was forgotten. A bond was being forged between them, not of seduction or instinct, but of shared purpose and a grim, mutual respect. Kalen listened without judgment, his focus absolute. He saw not just the intelligence, data Elian provided, but the immense courage it took for him to provide it. At one point, Elian's voice faltered, the memory of a particularly brutal training simulation overwhelming him. He fell silent, his hands clenched into fists, his breathing shallow. Kalen didn't press him. He simply waited, his presence a solid, patient anchor in the storm of Elian's past. After a long moment, Elian took a shuddering breath and continued. The quiet support was more effective than any command or encouragement could ever have been. It was an act of trust. Finally, as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the mountain peaks outside the window, Kalen deactivated the display. "That's enough for now," he said, his voice gentle. "You need to rest." He gestured to a door Elian hadn't noticed before. "There's a room through there. It's quiet. No one will disturb you." Elian stood, his body aching with an exhaustion that was more than just physical. He felt scoured clean, raw, but whole. He walked toward the door, then paused, turning back to face the Alpha. "Why?" he asked, the question that had been hovering beneath all the others. "Why are you doing this?" "For me?" Kalen looked at him, his face illuminated by the soft, grey morning light. His expression was serious, the lines around his eyes toward their gitched with the weariness of a long and difficult night. "I am not doing this for you, Elian," he said, and the words, though they should have stung, were delivered with a strange sort of kindness. "I am doing this because a system that creates a weapon like you is a system that must be dismantled. I am doing it because no child should be forged into a tool. I am doing it for the future of Ethelgard, and for every person, Alpha, Beta, and Omega, who deserves the freedom to have a name, a scent, and a self." He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "You are not the reason for this war, but you have become its catalyst and its most important symbol of hope." Elian held his gaze, and for the first time, he didn't see a target or an alpha. He saw an ally. He saw the man who had given him back his name. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the immense debt, the shared path that now stretched before them. Then he turned and walked into the quiet room, closing the door on his past and taking the first tentative step into an unknown, dangerous, and gloriously uncertain future. The dawn that broke over the Ethelgard reach was sharp and clear, the sun's rays catching the snow on the distant peaks and setting them ablaze with a fierce, white light. It felt like the first morning of a new world. From the observation deck where he had once played the part of a victim, Elian watched the day begin, a mug of hot, steaming tea warming his hands. He was dressed not in the soft, deceptive clothes of Rhys Alistair, but in a simple, practical tunic of dark grey wool, the uniform of Ethelgard's inner circle. It felt strange, like a costume for a role he hadn't yet learned, but it also felt solid, real. The wounds on his wrists were healing, the angry red fading to a pale pink. But the most significant change was internal. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety, the ever-present voice of the mission clock counting down in his head, was gone. In its place was a quiet, focused resolve. It was not peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. He heard footsteps and turned to see Kalen approaching, carrying a data slate. The Alpha looked as though he hadn't slept, but his energy was undiminished, his presence as powerful and centered as ever. He stopped beside Elian, their shoulders almost touching as they looked out at the sprawling landscape below. "My intelligence team has been working through the night with the data you provided," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet morning air. "They've found something." a pattern in the chrysalis's movements. It avoids charted space, but it has to emerge periodically to resupply and communicate. It uses gravitational slingshots around dead stars to mask its energy signature. Based on your memory of its last known position and its operational protocols, we've narrowed its probable location to one of 3 uninhabited systems in the Serpent's Coil Nebula. He held up the data slate. A complex astrogation chart glowed on its surface, 3 systems circled in amber. It's a long shot, but it's the first real lead anyone has ever had on Valerius's command ship. Elian studied the chart, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The Serpent's Coil, a place of stellar nurseries and dying stars, a chaotic, dangerous region of space that most ships avoided. It was the perfect hiding place. "He'll have scouts," Elian said, his mind slipping back into the familiar patterns of tactical analysis. "A perimeter of cloaked drones. They'll detect any ship that comes within a light year." Kalen nodded. "Which is why we won't be sending a ship. Not a large one, at least." He swiped the screen, bringing up the schematics of a small, sleek vessel. It was a long-range scout, heavily modified for stealth. "The Wraith. It has the best cloaking technology in the sector, and its heat signature is negligible. We send a small team, infiltrate the system, locate the chrysalis, and plant a tracking beacon. Once we have a permanent lock on its position, we can plan the second phase." The implication was clear. A small team, one that would need an expert on the chrysalis's internal systems, someone who could bypass its security, someone who knew its secrets from the inside out. "You want me to go?" Elian stated. It wasn't a question. Kalen turned to face him fully, his grey eyes searching Elian's. "I am not ordering you," he said, his tone serious. "After everything you've been through, no one would blame you if you chose to stay here, to disappear and build a new life in safety. The choice is yours. But yes, you are the only one who can do this." The fear was there, a cold, familiar serpent coiling in his gut. The thought of being back in that sterile, controlled environment, even as an infiltrator, was terrifying. But it was overshadowed by something else, something new and fierce, a desire for retribution, not just for himself, but for all the other numbered units, the other children whose names and faces he barely remembered, but whose shared trauma was a part of him. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady, surprising even himself with its conviction. A flicker of something, respect, approval, passed through Kalen's eyes. "Good," he said simply. "We leave in 3 days. That gives us time to prepare you." The preparation was intense. Elian spent hours with Kalen's technical teams, poring over the schematics of the chrysalis he had helped them create from his memories. He worked with their infiltration specialists, learning to use Ethelgard's more robust, less subtle technology. He was a quick study, his consortium training providing a terrifyingly effective foundation. But the most important part of his preparation was not tactical. Kalen insisted he spend time each day simply walking the citadel, interacting with its people, acclimating to a world without constant threat and manipulation. He ate in the communal mess hall, listening to the easy banter of the guards and technicians. He spent an hour in the arboretum, learning the names of the plants from the quiet beta who tended them. He was learning to be a person, not a tool. His own scent was slowly, tentatively strengthening. The sharp green notes were still there, but the underlying sweetness was becoming more distinct, a fragrance of wild honey that was uniquely his. He was no longer a void. He was becoming a presence. On the evening before their departure, Kalen found him once again in the music room. The grand piano was silent, its lid closed. Elian was standing by the large window, watching as the twin moons of Aethelgard rose over the mountains. "Are you ready?" Kalen asked from the doorway. Elian nodded without turning. "As I'll ever be." Kalen walked to stand beside him. For a long time, they stood in a comfortable silence, a silence that was no longer a weapon or a test, but a shared understanding. "When this is over," Kalen said, his voice soft, "you will be free to go wherever you wish, to be whoever you wish." Elian finally turned to look at him. The Alpha's face was cast in the pale, silvery light of the moons, his expression unreadable, but calm. "I know," Elian said, and for the first time he realized he didn't know where he would go or who he would be. The future was a blank page, and for the first time in his life, he was the one holding the pen. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating thought he had ever had. The final image of the story was not one of closure, but of a beginning. It was of Elian, no longer Unit 734 or the phantom Rhys Alistair, standing beside Kalen Voronova on the bridge of the Wraith as it slipped silently out of Aethelgard's orbit. On the main view screen, the star field glittered, a vast and dangerous expanse. Toward the edge of the screen, the faint, ethereal glow of the Serpent's Coil Nebula beckoned. They were two figures against the endless night, a fallen weapon and a renegade Alpha, their personal battle now the first shot in a war for the soul of the galaxy. The game of seduction was over. The hunt had begun. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril. But for the first time, Elian felt not the cold grip of duty, but the faint, warm stirrings of hope. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian, and he was finally going home, not to a place he had been, but to the person he was always meant to become.